Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Nathaniel Batchelder. Welcome to our show.
Thank you.
So you're with the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Can you tell me about that organization?
Yes, I can. OK-CADP was founded about 39 or 40 years ago and has variously had monthly meetings and all kinds of activities on the side, an annual dinner banquet. And whenever there's an execution in Oklahoma, there's a vigil by the side of the governor's mansion with a large banner, 24 feet long. It says, stop executions, don't kill for me. And there'll be 8, 10, 12, 20 people standing behind that on the day of an execution, scheduled 1 hour before the execution is scheduled to happen. And then when we get the news at the hour or afterwards that the death penalty person has died, then we circle up and we have a vigil, and it's not religious, but we do have people giving testimony and how they're feeling and so on and so on. And that's been happening for 25 or 30 years. I've been involved for at least 20, 25 years in all of those. And that's one activity. It's pretty public, so that when there's an execution, people driving by see the banner and they honk and we wave. And one time we were there and it was an execution and we had the banner and a police car pulled up and pulled over by the curb. And it's a 4-lane street in front of the governor's mansion. We thought, oh my gosh, we're going to be asked for a permit or something. And the police officer rolled the window down and he said, "I'm with you." And we said, "Well, thank you, officer." And he drove off. Those kinds of things happen, and that's a shot in the arm. People recognize the banner now. And there are TV cameras across the street, and usually KTOK radio comes over and interviews a few people. Sometimes we have family members of the person on death row with us. Of course, the executions take place in McAllister, which is at the far east end of the state. Some people go out there to be there. There's a priest in Tulsa who comes down for the executions, and he is virtually every time he's there. And sometimes the family members are outside the prison, and sometimes some of them are in to witness the execution. There have been a lot of executions. You probably know, and your listeners know, that Oklahoma is a red state where a majority of people think that the death penalty is justified. Certainly in huge crimes like Timothy McVeigh blowing up the Murrah building, well, he certainly deserved to die. Don't you agree? Well, that's a good question. There was a man who had a business, and he was going to meet with his daughter, Julie, that day for lunch. And the explosion happened at 9 o'clock. And his daughter was killed. A couple of weeks afterwards, somebody said, "Well, surely you support, execution of Timothy McVeigh." And he said, "I have to think about that." He actually came out publicly against capital punishment and against Timothy McVeigh. And 1 or 2 years later, he went to visit Timothy McVeigh's father. And they had a good conversation, and the daughter was there, and they walked out at the end. And Timothy McVeigh's Army picture was on the wall, and he said he sure was a handsome young man. Well, they both had lost children. He lost his daughter, Julie, and the father lost. And I guess the McVeighs said, we haven't had too many sympathetic visitors. I may remember the name of that man. That's a famous kind of a story. Also, we have not exactly a speakers bureau, but when we get asked to speak at a civic club or a high school or a college, one or the other of us will go and talk about the death penalty. And I'm sure you're familiar, as are your listeners, with the 12 or 13 reasons why the death penalty should be abolished. And there are all kinds of injustices in it. Of course, poor people are executed more often than wealthy people. People of color are executed more often in similar cases than white people. Religion plays a part. And one of the things that the Oklahoma Coalition has succeeded in doing in Oklahoma, following on the federal move in the same direction, was to prohibit the execution of someone who was considered mentally ill, for God's sake. Well, that was something I think that the coalition is in their success column. We do lobby for abolition, but we also lobby for a moratorium. And there's quite a history of efforts to achieve a moratorium in Oklahoma. We're not there yet, but I think abolition feels like a more radical step to some people, and that voters and others may be more amenable to speaking about a moratorium. So that is probably a description of the coalition. The board meets once a month, and we talk about what's coming up, and the banquet's a big deal. We've had some important speakers at our annual banquet. One of them is Sister Helen Prejean. A long time ago, Adam Luck was a member of the clemency board appointed by the governor. And after he had voted like 4 times for clemency, the governor asked him to resign so he could appoint somebody else. Adam Luck was our speaker at the banquet that year, and he had some powerful things to say. The name Brian Stevenson is probably well known to you and your listeners. He's the black attorney who has started the operation to end the death penalty, and he visits people on death row nationally. He's quite a speaker, and he has spoken in Oklahoma City a few times, and that's something we can give publicity to. The religion editor at the Daily Oklahoman, now called The Oklahoman, the statewide newspaper, I think she's with us. Of course, she can't say that, but she does cover the events and prints the news releases that come from the coalition and so on. There was a good story, an article that had the details about the recent execution of Richard Rojam, which was in June, and the article had a picture. It was a picture of 10 of us holding that banner. I don't have a way to show that to you now because we're not on Zoom audio video, but it's a good picture. I mean, here you have a 24-foot banner with 10 people behind it and right in front of the governor's mansion, and that was published in the Oklahoman. And some of us, particularly me, have texted and emailed that video that photograph to a number of state legislators and certainly to the governor. And we're not there yet. There is a case where our current governor sits. There was a clemency hearing. I can't remember which case it was, but the Pardon and Parole Board voted 5-0 for clemency, and the governor
Are you talking about the Glossip case?
No, I'm not. The Glossip case is a big one,
Right.
but we can review some of the history, or you may want to jump in with a question.
Well, I was going to ask you, I mean, it seems like I follow this stuff fairly closely, and it seems like Oklahoma has more than its share of these problematic death penalty cases. And I understand it's a red state, but still, there are lots of red states, and it's really either coming out of Oklahoma or Texas or occasionally Alabama. It seems like, the majority of these cases these days, maybe Missouri occasionally.
Well, that raises a good point, because when you talk about executions in Oklahoma, the verb botched comes up. In 2014, Charles Warren was executed, and he died in the execution process. But they ultimately it was reported, that they had used the wrong drugs to kill him. In 2015, a year later, Clayton Lockett was executed. And I don't know what the trouble was with the drugs, or how they gave them, or how they didn't go. Apparently, the physician in the room couldn't get an IV started, and there was blood all over the place. And the physician in the room said, "Well, who's going to clean up my clothes, for God's sake?" And that execution took 45 minutes. That was Clayton Lockett in 2015. Mary Fallin was the governor at the time, and she called for a moratorium on executions. Let's slow down. Let's figure out why Oklahoma is nationally recognized for botching executions. I mean, the whole thing's horrible, and it's an abomination no matter how they do it. So that moratorium started, and a grand jury was actually called in 2016, convened to review the death penalty in the criminal justice system in Oklahoma. They worked on that for a year, and they had dozens of recommendations that were not followed. They were not implemented. But that's a formal effort to understand what's going on with the death penalty in Oklahoma. The death penalty was resumed in 2020 by the order of the current governor, Governor Kevin Stitt. Despite everything, despite these efforts to have a moratorium, in 2016, there was also, by an order of Mary Fallin, a commission formed with 5 members to study the death penalty in Oklahoma. And one of the members was Governor Brad Henry was a former governor. He was on this commission. It was pretty serious. And they had a report after 2 years of 46 recommendations to make the death penalty in criminal justice in Oklahoma more just. To date, as far as we know, none of them have been implemented. So in 2020, the death penalty was resumed under Governor Stitt. And that brings us to the case in 2021 of Julius Jones. Julius Jones was the black guy convicted of a murder and stealing a car with some other people. There were a lot of details of the trial that were questionable, and there was a huge movement in Oklahoma to call for mercy and commutation of sentence for Julius Jones. Ultimately, when his execution was scheduled, it was like, okay, get the banner out. We're going to go to the governor's mansion. Julius Jones is going to be executed. A number of state representatives called the governor and asked him to not go through with the execution. There was a rally the night before the execution where I think there were 500 or 600 Oklahomans. I was there. A number of speakers, Julius Jones should not be executed, etc. Okay, on the day of the execution, which was to be in the afternoon, high school students from 5 high schools, maybe 6, walked out of class, and the purpose of that was to protest the execution of Julius Jones. Well, 2 hours before the execution was scheduled, Governor Stitt ordered that the execution not take place, but that Julius Jones' sentence would be commuted to life in prison without parole. The public pressure on the governor and the high school students, and that made a difference. Well, that can't happen every time. But Julius Jones was a very popular athlete in high school and college. And anyway, in 2022, a year later, I don't know who paid for this or who ordered it, but an independent law firm, a big one in Dallas, was scheduled to do an independent study of the case of Richard Glossip. He had been on death row for 24 years at that time, but he had not been executed. And they came back with a report that the evidence that they were able to pursue indicated that a death sentence was not appropriate, and that possibly Richard Glossip was not even guilty of what he was accused of. He was accused of paying somebody to go murder the motel director and steal the money. Well, and we could go into the details of that, but anyway, ultimately, in 2023, he was scheduled for execution again. Now, Richard Glossip has been scheduled for execution 3 times before that. In fact, he had 3 last meals. And in one of the cases, he was taken to the execution chamber. And in each case, something intervened, like we don't have the drugs, or we're not sure of this, or something's not working, and so they couldn't get an IV started, or whatever it was. Richard Glossip, and you mentioned his name because it's well known. The update on that is that the Supreme Court intervened and said he should not be executed while the Supreme Court, review the details of the case. Well, that was 2023, and there's no answer yet. We don't have an answer for the Supreme Court. It could come in today or next week or next year. Who knows what they're doing? But Richard is married to a woman who's a lawyer, Lee Glossip, and she's a very quiet person. But that case has gotten all kinds of publicity nationally. You may know that the TV show host Phil McGraw came to Oklahoma City to participate in a rally at the state capitol, and there were 400 or 500 people there, and he got a lot of publicity. But the point was to lift the Richard Glossip case, which is now pending in the Supreme Court. And
one thing that's interesting about that case is that you had Republican legislators look into the case and basically come to the conclusion that this guy is innocent. And yet nobody seems to be able to completely stop this execution.
There's a Republican House member, Kevin McDougal, and he has been an advocate for rounding up Republicans who might say, well, in this case, there's so much doubt that even we will oppose the execution. It has not made a difference with the governor, unfortunately. But McDougal also introduced a bill before the House to have a moratorium on the death penalty while all the 46 recommendations of the commission and the recommendations of the Dallas law firm and all the people studying this abomination and the botched executions in Oklahoma. That bill had Republican co-sponsors, and it might well have passed, but it was never brought to the floor for a vote. That's the nature of our legislature, which is more than 2/3 of conservatives, I'll say Republicans, in the House and the Senate. They can override a veto of the governor if they choose to, and they're very conservative and in the worst sense of what conservative means. That's where we are in Oklahoma. It's a tough battle. Those of us who are active in the coalition to abolish, we should say the coalition for a moratorium, because that's where we might have some headway. I kind of feel as though there's a kinship spiritually with people who were always against slavery in the United States. And no matter what they did, they worked well for 200 years to try to abolish slavery. And they just had to say, we're doing the best we can. And, there were steps in the direction of justice and steps in the direction of states that said, okay, we're not going to be a death penalty state. Well, that had repercussions. Anyway, here we are. Oklahoma, bar none, has more executions per capita than any other state in the nation. We have had for 20 years, and we still do.
So I'm wondering how you got involved in this in the first place.
Well, thank you. In 1984 and 85, which is like 35 years ago, I was laid off from a job because of finances in the museum, and I had some other difficulties. And I learned about the Sisters of Benedict in Oklahoma City. And they had started their peace house, a peace office in a bedroom of their monastery. And I heard they were having a peace awareness weekend. This was, of course, in the time of Reagan, and the nuclear arms race was hot in Central America politics, and that was hot. And one of the speakers at the meeting was Bishop Thomas Gumbleton. And the other speaker was Senator Mark Hatfield, a Republican. And both of them supported reductions of nuclear weapons and dangers and what have you. And I went to that weekend. Well, I met
Mark
sisters.
Hatfield, of course, was a liberal, even though he was a Republican. I just need to jump in with that point.
Well, he was. And it was pretty impressive to have a Republican senator against nuclear weapons speaking at it. There were probably, 800, 1,000 people at this thing. It was held at a big Methodist church. Over the weekend, it was Saturday and Sunday. Well, I contacted the sisters. You're asking how I got into this. And I said, could I be a volunteer with your group? And they said, oh, sure. So I came over, and sometimes I would be in the office in their monastery, and phone would ring, and I'd answer it and say, Benedictine Peace House, and talk to somebody, and, well, get Sister Leona. This is for her. Anyway, the sisters rented an apartment 2 houses down to have an office for the Benedictine Peace House. And that's where the sisters came every day, and I did too. I mean, I did not have a salary, but at the time, I was able to live cheap with style. And I really felt, if I'm working with Sisters of Benedict, I can't be too far off base. But we started things against the nuclear arms race. We started things about Central America. There was what you might call an underground railroad of people who would pick up Salvadoran or Guatemalan refugees who were coming from California and they wanted to go to Canada. And these are people, a couple of people I knew, a couple that were Mennonites. They would pick these people up in western Oklahoma and drive them up to Tulsa or wherever and turn them over to the next car. That was illegal, but they never got arrested. We've been involved with environmental issues, and the Peace House now, the Sisters got out of it in 1990 and went to form a monastery in another town. But I and others have kept the Peace House going. We no longer call it Benedictine. People say, Nathaniel, are you a priest? No, mostly a Unitarian, more nearly a humanist. But I do go to a church today, and that's beside the point. I'm proud to still be involved with the Peace House. We have a board that meets 4 times a year, and a newsletter we mail out 4 times a year. And I guess we're pretty well known. I meet people and they say, "Oh, I've seen your name. You had something in the Oklahoman not too long ago." Well, God knows I have an opinion, and sometimes I express it in an op-ed piece, and I submit it to the Oklahoman or the Tulsa World or the Denver Post or the Chicago Tribune or the Miami Herald. Sometimes I really have no idea if it got published, but issues come up and they spark. My parents were English teachers, so I learned how to write because they would show me papers by their sophomore students and said, "Batch, you can write better than this." And I thought I'd better. So I may be known as one of the Oklahoma persistent liberals, and there's a lot at stake these days, but that's my introduction.
And then finally, it seems like everybody has their own reason for opposing the death penalty. What is yours?
A host of reasons. Number one, I don't think the state should kill, period. And that pertains to Timothy McVeigh, who blew up the Murrah building. I say that if Timothy McVeigh had been given life without parole, maybe 10, 20 years after the event, he would have had a change of heart and would have apologized. Redemption by virtue of spirit. So I'm just flat against capital punishment overall. The injustices of it about race and poverty and so on are clear, and they come up when there's an execution in Oklahoma. It's another case. As Brian Stevenson points out, virtually everybody on death row around the country have a terrible life for one reason or another. A bad family or drugs and alcohol in the home or parental abuse or God only knows what. And that's not an excuse for a crime. It's not an excuse. It doesn't excuse violence, but it should make mercy possible, that anybody on death row ought to have the mercy of a life sentence, at least to be alive, and God only knows what they can do alive. A lot of people get college degrees, etc. So there was a woman who was going to be executed in Oklahoma. This may have been 17 years ago or more. The Reverend Jesse Jackson came down from Chicago on her behalf, and there was a march, and those things get a lot of publicity. One of the things happening in Oklahoma with regards to cases where the death penalty is on the books is we're getting more and more juries are voting for life in prison or life without parole. They're not voting for the death penalty. So that's progress socially in Oklahoma. Although, to be on the jury, they say, "Are you against the death penalty?" Well, if they say yes, then they're rejected. And we remain one of the several red states. I wouldn't say we're the reddest, but I'm motivated to hang in there. I think progressive liberals in Oklahoma have some kind of a rebellious streak. I mean, we just won't quit. So anyway, that gets me up in the morning, and I live down the street from the Peace House these days. I got married 7 years ago. A good move. I never had a success at that beforehand, but I'm delighted to be married to a very gentle woman. We agree on religion and politics and spirit things, and we're vegetarians, beside the point. But I go over to the office of the Peace House and pick up the mail, and we have an address, and there's a sign on the front door, and we're still here, by God.
Yeah. Well, fascinating to hear the stories from the heart of the beast, really, in Oklahoma. Kind of the epicenter now for death penalty battles, along with a couple other states. I mean, it is remarkable. I've been doing this a long time now, and we're really at the point where there are only like 5 or 6 states most years that are executing anyone.
Yeah.
So that's progress.
Well, we publicized that to belong to the European Union, nations must have abolished capital punishment. And we try to present examples of humane imprisonment some places and what the possibility is. But yes, it does come down to Oklahoma and 4, 5, 6. The states that have not officially abolished it, I think one of their 17 who have abolished the death penalty, be that as it may, another 20 are simply not executing people,
right?
For one reason or another. So it is, in a way, a parallel to the abomination of slavery. That it just took a long time, and ultimately, I know that we're on the right side of the issue.
All right. Well, thanks, Nathaniel, for joining us today and talking about the Oklahoma Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty.
By God, we're still here. And I want to thank you, David, for wherever this will go and whatever it might do. It's good for people to know that there's a population in Oklahoma and members of many, many houses of worship who are for all the good 6, 8, 10 issues that we might agree on if we got off death penalty and talked about women's rights, etc. But I think we are making progress, and we keep hope alive.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next week for more tales from the injustice system. Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.